I'm going to talk about where the corona crisis leaves us in terms of economy. And I've been asked to focus particularly on the universal basic income, but I'd like to do some scene setting to explain why that's particularly relevant in the situation we're facing right now. So I'm going to start with a number of things that we've learned through this crisis, which I think have changed people's view of how their life is, but particularly in my case, how the economy works, and also how our political system works. And I think the overwhelmingly important lesson is that politics really matters and government is very powerful. So when the shit really hits the fan, you're not raising questions about how much money you can afford, or whether you need a big government or a small government. Essentially, government wades in, and government has the power to do extraordinary things and change our lives in extraordinary ways very, very quickly. And obviously, as Greens, that's really important because we want the government to act like that in the case of the climate crisis. And all these ideas we've had for years about how government can't do that and it takes a long time to turn around a super tanker, and this suggestion that government is powerless and helpless has been completely blown away. And we have to really capitalize on that and insist that they take a similar sense of urgency with regard to the climate emergency. We've also learned that actually governments can afford to spend money. All those years they spent telling us we had to have austerity, that was about political priorities. When they need to, they can reach into their pockets and find an enormous amount of money. Fortunately, Rishi Sunak does know where the magic money tree is, and it's called the Bank of England. And he has managed not only to borrow money, which we can do cheaply at the moment, but also to create money directly. Sadly, as we'll see later, he's sending that in entirely the wrong direction. But we've also learned, I would say, more social things about what really matters to us. And one of the things that we need to make a headway with as Greens is this idea that it's economic growth that we need, that should be the main objective of the economy. Because what we've seen through the pandemic is actually, it isn't the size of the economy that matters, it's quality that matters much more than quantity. And that the bits of the economy we really value were not the ones we thought we valued, and the same with workers. So it's actually people who work in supermarkets and carers and delivery people that have kept us going, although they're very poorly paid and we haven't valued them previously. So I think we really need to be raising questions about what the economy is for and which parts of it are really important and which parts we value. Of course, we've also learned that the idea that there's no such thing as society is complete nonsense, because community and solidarity have flourished through this pandemic. And we've worked, when it's worked well, it's because we've stood together as a community, and we've all learned that the most important people in our lives are actually our next door neighbours, and living in a strong community has really provided a lot of support to us. And finally, the last thing I would say from an economic point of view that's an important lesson is that actually global supply chains are fragile. And in terms of what Mary was saying about how we're perceived as a party that very much values the local, whether we're talking about contact tracing and the idea of the community shield that we've been putting forward, or the idea of provisioning for our basic needs, you're much more secure if you're part of a community farm down the road like I am than if you're dependent on a supermarket. And this is something that's going to come into play more because supply chains for food continue to be disrupted. And given about half the food that we could be growing here is actually imported, we may well see more of that. And it's important to focus on local economies and local markets and local producers in terms of our food, because human scale economies are much more resilient. And again, that's an important lesson in terms of climate change. So just to conclude this introductory part, I've been thinking about this pandemic as what I think of as a war without a war, because all my life as a Green, I've been really concerned about what can bring sufficient radical potential to enable us to make the really significant transformations that we always know we've needed to make, but we've never really had the sort of shaking up of society. And if you look back at history, whether you think about 1945 or actually even as far back as the Civil War, whenever we've seen really significant social and economic change, it's been as a consequence of a war. But in this case, I think the corona crisis can provide that impetus without us having to, thousands of people have died, but we haven't ended up in a war. And let's use that opportunity, because people have really been shaken out of their comfort zone and are looking at the world in a different way. And I think we need to put forward our message very strongly as Greens not only in media outlets, although that's really important, but also in terms of our neighbours. And if you do have the courage to go to the pub, maybe there as well. So there's two sides to the crisis I'd like to consider. One is universal basic income, and I'm going to get there soon. But the other one is just to think about what's happening in terms of jobs and livelihoods. Obviously, we've seen an enormous loss of economic activity, and that's not because people didn't want to carry on shopping and buying things. It's because we were forced to close down a lot of businesses to protect people from the disease. And so we shouldn't underestimate the enormous impact that will have on people's lives as jobs are lost. And we have to be there with our platform, Nobody Left Behind, as the European Greens are putting forward, no community left behind, as we go through this transition. But we also need to question which parts of the economy we support in coming back, because without public support, all businesses will be bust right now, or almost all businesses anyway. You can see there's very interesting data about which businesses are thriving, but an awful lot of the shops and retail and manufacturing without the furlough scheme would not have continued. And that means it's our choice which companies and which workplaces and which hospitality outlets we're choosing to support, because it's basically our money. And so I've come up with this idea of economic triage, which you may not like that phrase. It's a bit of a sort of economicsy phrase, but it's basically about choosing which companies and sectors we continue to support. And obviously the other important concept is industrial conversion, because again, this pandemic is giving us an unprecedented opportunity to change the way our economy works. So I think we can divide the types of businesses and manufacturing that's out there between three types. There are types of business that have no place in a net zero carbon future, whether that's very energy intensive, pointless industries, or industries that encourage us to consume, such as the advertising industry. These industries are working against what we need to do to build the green society, and I think we should be very clear that they don't receive public funding. Other examples are companies that put all their profits into tax havens and don't put that money back into the UK. So we could come up with a series of conditions. In fact, I have done this in the Less is More paper, and also the European Greens have a similar paper where we say, if companies don't live up to these basic conditions, being able to play a part in a net zero carbon future and be a socially responsible business that pays its taxes, they cannot receive public money. And then, of course, there's companies which are already part of the sustainable economy, whether that's companies that are involved in retrofitting homes or building wind turbines, renewable energy companies, and so on. And obviously, we need to focus the investment on those kind of companies, and that's really what we call the Green New Deal. But at the same time, we have to have that catchphrase together with the catchphrase of the just transition, working with trade unions to make sure that we don't throw people on the scrap heap, but we train people and prepare them for the jobs that we need them to be doing to make our economy resilient for the climate emergency. And actually, with the Green New Deal, we're talking about thousands of good quality jobs right across the country in all the communities that were left behind in the last industrial conversion that we went through in the 70s and 80s. And of course, in the middle, we've got those companies and businesses that need to convert. And I think there we should be saying that we do not allow any public money to go to them unless they produce a clear plan for conversion, for becoming more environmentally sustainable, for reducing their throughput of resources, and most obviously reducing their carbon emissions. And because a lot of companies are kind of mothballed at the moment and in lower levels of production, it's a really good way of insisting that they go through that industrial conversion now. So that's on the one side, but however we go through this, we know we're looking at economic disruption, and that does mean a threat to people's livelihoods, and it does mean loss of jobs. And so right from the beginning of this pandemic, we said that universal basic income was clearly the best way of supporting people through this economic crisis and through this challenge to their livelihoods. And unlike the Chancellor's furlough scheme, universal basic income would allow companies and individuals to operate with flexibility in terms of how they work. So if some companies want people back just part of the time, then they could continue to get that basic income. They would have the flexibility to come back. Whereas with furlough, it's either in or out. It's either open or closed. And also, of course, there are large sectors and numbers of people who are completely falling through the net with furlough. and are just not getting any support at all. So because we need to be creative now, because we need to think differently, because we need to act flexibly, it's really important that people are guaranteed that their fundamental needs are met. And that's what universal basic income would achieve. So universal basic income has now become much more popular, and because of coronavirus, but it was actually always relevant to providing basic support for everybody, but also in the area of automation, and when jobs are being destroyed because computers can do those jobs more effectively and more efficiently than human beings. Now, for many people, that seems like a tragedy, but if you manage the process so that people do have basic security and so that they feel supported through that process, then it could be a world where people have much more time to spend on activities they enjoy, much more time to spend with their family, and actually have a much better life if they're supported. And that was always part of the purpose of basic income. So it's the policy we need for now because of coronavirus, but it's also the policy we need for now because of the shifts in the labour market. So let me just quickly say what the Green Party specifically proposes. And our proposal for basic income is that somebody earning the minimum wage would see their income increase by 10%, by between 10 and 15% through the unified basic income. So we didn't produce a specific costing in the general election because actually that's an incredibly complex and expensive exercise. But we have done that previously, and it does show that, especially if you abolish the rest of the benefit system and you take into account that for people who are receiving a tax-free allowance, that is effectively netted off against the unified basic income, then it is an affordable policy, although it is an expensive policy. But of course, an awful lot of people at the moment are already receiving some form of benefit. And so with those people, it does operate as a substitute for the benefits they're already receiving. We're suggesting that we would phase in this universal basic income at a level sufficient to meet people's basic needs, but we're not talking about keeping people at the same rate of income they're on now. And we would expect most people who are of working age to work in addition to receiving the basic income, but they will probably choose fewer hours of work, and that would enable us to share the work fairly, to facilitate people working on a 4-day week and also spending more time in their community and with people they care about. And it has to be said that we would pay a rate for children that would be smaller than the rate for adults, and we would pay a rate for elderly people and disabled people that was higher than the standard rate, and housing benefit will continue to be paid. So other people have noticed what a good idea this sort of policy is as a result of the corona crisis, and an early day motion in Parliament gained support from nearly 100 MPs, and that's much more support than we've previously seen from politicians for this policy. But the problem is that both Labour and the Tories are wedded to the wage labour system. So the Tories from the side of capital, Labour from the side of workers, but both of them accept the kind of deal that there is under capitalism, that essentially you have to work or else you're in poverty. As Greens, we don't accept that. We think, you know, you have merit as a human being when you don't work as well as when you do work. And so we don't accept this idea of strivers versus skivers, or, you know, that people who are claiming welfare are a different kind of people we can call scroungers. So I think in terms of welfare, the two main parties have a real problem with accepting basic income, and that's a shame for us, for them. But it means that we have an opportunity to really argue our positive case for a welfare state, which unfortunately the two main parties, the Tweedledum and Tweedledee parties, have long ago abandoned. Why do we support this as the Green Party? I've already mentioned some of the principles, but I would just like to say that to me this is a fundamental policy that lies at the heart of how Greens perceive the economy. We think that every citizen has a right to basic financial security. Sometimes people say, why should you have something for nothing? But it's really obvious in our society that it's the wealthy who have something for nothing, not the poor. And what we're saying is everybody should not have that fear that they will not be able to meet their basic needs. We also believe in universalism when it comes to welfare. And the problem with means testing is that it humiliates people, it undermines people's confidence and their dignity, but also it means a lot of people choose not to claim, whereas a universal benefit is paid to you. It's not about need, it's about your right to a universal income as part of the wealth of our society. And that's why I think of the economy as being, as the idea of commonwealth being central to how I think about the economy, and the universal basic income is your share of that commonwealth. And of course, perhaps most importantly, if you think about how it would impact you as an individual, so many people in our society just waste their lives because they're focused on livelihood and earning money and not what will be best for them. So universal basic income would support you to really allow your human spirit to flourish, to allow you to do with your life what your life is really for. And that's probably not some of the crap jobs that people are forced into because they do not have their basic livelihood secure. So I just wanted to, obviously, you know, we're welcome to debate that in a second, but I just wanted to close by underlining some of the key economic demands that we have an opportunity to put forward because of the way people are changing their minds because of corona crisis. And I would say overwhelmingly the most important is that people are very clear that after the financial crisis, the rich got richer and the poor paid the price. And I think this sense of radicalization that we're seeing at the moment is because people know that was wrong. And we have to be very clear that this time we want to achieve a large redistribution in society, whether that's through wealth tax or other changes to taxes, or actually making claims on different kinds of assets. We need to make sure that we come out of this crisis not just more sustainable, but much more equal as a society as well. I think there's also an opportunity to argue that point about what makes you secure in terms of the actual things you need for your daily life, to argue against the crazy kind of global supply chains, which do make us insecure, as well as costing a lot in terms of energy that's just wasted. You may have seen the Prime Minister's, you know, appeal to Tim Tam importers. I mean, it was unbelievable, suggesting that we need to have a trade deal with New Zealand so that we can eat their chocolate biscuits like penguins that are called Tim Tams, rather than our penguins. That is the complete insanity of the Tories' view of what the trade system is for. The trade system should be for trading things you cannot produce here. Any other system is exploitative and incredibly wasteful of energy in a climate emergency. And finally, I think there's a chance to really have that conversation with people about whether they want to run their life in such a way that they hate the 50 weeks, but they just escape for those 2 weeks by flying off to a foreign holiday. What sort of world have we created where people are having to escape what is their life for just those 2 weeks of the year? Don't we have a right to have a good life for 52 weeks of the year? And what kind of policies would we need? And obviously my answer is the Manifesto for a Sustainable Society, because what people really value is relationships, obviously basic security, but also that ability to spend time with people they love, to spend time with nature. And I think people have had a different experience during this lockdown, and it's an experience that really helped guide them into some of the things that we argue about the economy. So that's all I had to say. I'm sorry if I spoke too long, but hopefully we've got enough time for some questions and some discussion. Thank you.
Molly, thank you so much. I think there's a huge amount there that should bring questions forward. There's certainly a few on the sheet in front of me. First one is, are there any examples where universal basic income has operated successfully?
I've got that on my other sheet. I haven't brought it down with me. There's not very many examples where there's unconditional basic income, but as a result of the pandemic, quite a lot of countries, the Mediterranean countries, are introducing basic income for poor people on condition that they send their children to school or that they continue to look for work. So there's some sort of minimum income guarantee, but it doesn't meet the principles I outlined. Finland recently carried out a pilot study, a sort of research study, testing whether if people received a basic income, they would stop working. But it was just a small number of people, and they found that people didn't stop working, but they were much less stressed and happier, which is what we've always argued. In Brazil and other Latin American countries, I can't remember quite which, they have introduced quite a long time ago payment for poorer families, again on condition that they send their children to school and meet various other health requirements like vaccination and so on. Alaska is the only country in the world that pays a basic income, which is called the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is essentially people's share of the oil money that that was made in Alaska. So there's been kind of trials and experiments, but I wouldn't say anybody has gone the whole hog and introduced what we're proposing on a national basis without some kind of conditions.
The conditions might be what the next question comes to, actually, is would it be paid to everyone, regardless of their income in particular? what about people who don't actually need it at all?
This is, I think, a really important point. As I mentioned before, the principle of universalism is really important because, anyway, from my perspective, we don't want to be dividing society between people who claim welfare and people who don't claim welfare. It's a big lie anyway, because like if you live long enough, you're all going to be on welfare, right? Because you're all going to claim a pension. Very few people say, oh, I won't have my child benefit or I won't take my maternity benefit. But the purpose of that argument is to make people do jobs that they really don't want to do. And universal basic income is precisely so that people won't have to do jobs they really don't want to do. And that means that they'll have much more power in the labour market, which is why it's really a shame that Labour won't support it on principle. But repeat the question. I'm sorry, I've gone off on one now and I've forgotten.
Someone says, I think the essence of the question is universal basic income invariably means that we give a cash pay.
Yeah. So why do rich people get
wealth?
Universal basic income? Exactly. So as I said earlier, if you get a tax-free allowance, then that will essentially balance off against your universal basic income. So you will still continue to receive the basic income, but you won't get the tax-free allowance. So although we will pay it as a universal basic income, if you are earning enough to pay tax, then you will not receive anything more from the state because it will effectively be the same as the tax-free allowance that you are not receiving. So to me, that's a smart way of making a universal benefit, but not allowing extra money to go to wealthier people.
Yeah, there's lots of questions relating to that. Is it relates to the allowance? If I can shift off that for a moment, one thing that I've had this discussion with during the week is one there's been much more emphasis on local production and local spending during the lockdown. And I had a debate with one of our members who might be in with us today, that's Rupert Reed, regarding whether or not it's possible for this country to feed itself and to what degree, would a localized economy have to depend on imported food in particular?
Oh, well, it's a shame as well. I haven't got any of the studies with me now, but you can find a report called Can Britain Feed Itself? There's also various local versions of that. I think there was a Can Bristol Feed Itself. A few years ago, quite a lot of people did studies into that. Simon Fairley's work here is really interesting as well, because obviously the amount of food you can produce very much depends on what you eat and what kind of farming system you use. So a meat and dairy produced system is extremely hungry in terms of land, but on the other hand, it does refertilize that land. So if you move towards a fully vegan system, you would need a certain amount of land that was growing fertilizer crops, and that land will be out of production. But taking all those things into account, if people ate considerably less meat, you would need much less land to produce the food. So that's an answer to your question in terms of just, do we have enough land to feed ourselves? Obviously, we're a country that's very heavily populated, and that's because we have relied on mercantilism, being a trading nation for a long time, and that allowed money to come in and food to be imported to feed people. Whereas if we'd stayed closer to the land, our population wouldn't have expanded so much because we became an industrial trading economy. So this is more of a problem for us than it is with countries that have never fed themselves so little. But the point in history when we had the least food sovereignty was after the First World War. And then obviously in the Second World War, we moved much more towards feeding ourselves, and we've now moved back from that. But I don't have any doubt that we could produce enough food to feed ourselves in this country. The question is, what would we be eating, and would people be happy with that? But so my first principle is food that we eat, that we could produce ourselves, we do produce here. So let's take apples as an example. Sorry, I could go on about this probably for the whole hour, but let me just say, if we started by intending to produce all our own food, and we intended to move back to a system where people were well fed with good nutrition, and there was a seasonality around what they ate. So rather than waking up and thinking, what's in Jamie Oliver's cookbook, they woke up and thought, what food is being produced near where I am at this time of year? Then we would be moving towards providing more food for ourselves. But obviously we're not going to be able to grow things like bananas and coffee. Somebody did grow a banana in Stroud, but I can tell you what, it was very small and nobody ate it. But so there are things that we can't, this is what I call trade subsidiarity, things that you can't produce locally, you then move further afield to find. But then there's the question of like, I want a fruit, you know, do I want a strawberry or an apple? Here in Stroud, for most of the year, you should choose the apple, and we should bring in a tax system that encourages people to eat that food that is seasonal and local to them, and provide those incentives, rather than people just running their, you know, their choices as the supermarket suggests, which is strawberries all year, satsumas all year, and so on. So anyway, basically the bioregion economy covers this point in detail, as you can tell, but I haven't got more time to discuss it further now. And the other point is Meat, a Benign Extravagance by Simon Fairley, and the other book, which is really good on land, how to use land in a sustainable way.
Thank you so much for that. I've got a very couple of quick questions. One person here says, how do we stop people getting huge bonuses at the top? How will we ensure money doesn't go offshore? Because
well, I mean, make me the Chancellor. It's not complicated technically, it's just a political problem. I spent a long time in the European Parliament trying to resolve the issue of offshore, and we got a fair distance, but a lot of countries basically float on offshore, and we're at the centre of that. The City of London is at the centre of that. And other countries like the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Ireland, they all run a particular tax haven system, and that's why it was difficult to get those laws changed. So what we need to do is basically we need a country by country reporting system, which means that you see how much of their profits companies make in each country, and then they have to be taxed in that country according to how much of the value they made there. Because what they do is distribute profits around the world in sort of fake deals where they pay themselves an enormous amount of money for toilet rolls or consulting or whatever, literally toilet rolls in some cases. So from one part of the company to the other, so that they can say they earned the money there and pay the tax in a low tax country, jurisdiction. So that's called Common Consolidated Corporate Tax Base. It's a fairly technical proposal, but as I've explained to you, the principle of it is not complicated. The trouble is almost all European countries won't sign up to that. Britain actually was not so hostile to that, because we have our offshore territories that we run our tax havens through. But this can be managed technically. The trouble is some of the biggest and most powerful countries in the world will not do it politically. But that's why we need, you know, Bernie Sanders made this case in the case of the US. We make this case here. John McDonnell also was very good on this. But we need more people to vote for parties that support it, and we need to become the governments, basically. And as I said before, I think coronavirus does give us an opportunity to make those much more radical claims in terms of tax and wealth distribution. In bonuses, that's just a law. I mean, I worked on a law, Shareholder Rights Directive it was called, and you know, I argued we should just cap bonuses. We should cap salaries so nobody earns more than 10 times the poorest paid person in that organisation. There's laws that cover these things. Again, it's just like, you know, tell people that's in our policy and ask them to vote for us, because we are already proposing those things. We did succeed after the financial crisis. You probably recall, this is what made Philippe Lambert's famous. He put down a proposal that bankers should not be paid bonuses, and he just argued that until 5 o'clock in the morning, night after night after night, and in the end they all got bored and gave in. And so there are limits on bankers' bonuses. I mean, obviously they're nothing like as strict as they should be, but it just shows that it can be done. The reason we don't succeed is that other politicians fold, or other politicians are defending the interests of the wealthy.